The skies above Czechoslovakia in early May 1945 were a curious mix of chaos and silence. Below, battle-scarred fields lay still, smoke curling from ruined villages and shattered airfields. In this vast emptiness, a lone Messerschmitt Bf 109 sliced through the dawn. At its controls was Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, Germany's most lethal fighter race, bloodless in air-to-air combat, yet haunted by every life he had taken. On the morning of May 8th, with the war finally sputtering to its end, Hartmann found himself flying through the dawn sky, still a weapon of war with no enemy left to fight. He tensed the rudder and dove. Guns spitting, tracer rounds lanced into a Yakovlev Yak-7, shredding its engine to fiery fragments. The smaller aircraft cartwheeled out of control, plummeting toward the earth in flame and smoke. In that moment, time stretched. The roar of the Yak's engine, the sharp crack of Hartmann's trigger finger, and then profound silence as the wreckage slammed into the fields. The final kill of the war, number 352, was quietly registered in Hartmann's logbook, making him history's top fighter pilot. But it felt hollow. He thought of the young instructor in that Yak and felt a pang of guilt no tally could erase. He pulled up and circled above the crash site, eyes scanning the quiet horizon. It was unnaturally still. Above him, a battered sky, scarred by the contrails of the war's last dogfights, bore down like a wounded beast. Hartmann's ears were ringing, and his heart ached with the weight of every friend he would never see again. A single plane had shattered the quiet of peace with violence. The dawn air smelled of scorched grass and uncertainty. A steely knot formed in his gut. What came next was not in the sky, but on the ground. Surrender. Hartmann guided his 109 back to the unmarked landing strip. Around him, soldiers moved with defeat etched on their faces. The familiar clank of wheels on tarmac, shouted orders and distant cries filled the air as word of surrender rippled through the wreckage of the unit. Dozens of pilots and ground crew gathered under an ashen sky, breathing the acrid scent of burned fuel and scorched earth. Each man knew the war was finished, but none felt relief. There was only uncertainty and dread. Through the haze, a tall, hawkish officer emerged and strode toward Hartmann. It was Hans Scheidemann, a career Luftwaffe commander sent on one last errand. His uniform was immaculate despite the chaos. His face was pale and stern. Scheidemann's eyes searched Hartmann and Graf, the two most decorated pilots left. Under a makeshift lamp in a ruined hangar, Scheidemann spoke bluntly. "The Reich is collapsing. Soviet troops will overrun this place soon. The rest of GG-52 will stay and surrender to the Russians. But you two, Graf and Hartmann, fly west. The British will treat you fairly." Hartmann's jaw clenched as the words sank in. Graf's face went pale. Hartmann's mind reeled. All around them, pilots and crew froze, the final pieces of Germany's command laid bare. The Soviets were advancing on all fronts, starving, ruthless, and vengeful. It was no secret what they would do to capture German crews. Scheidemann added softly, almost pleading, "This is your chance. We both know Stalin values a Knight's Cross holder." He spoke of the Allies' mercy, but his words were thin. Hartmann wondered why a general would ask them to abandon their wing, to leave even families behind. As the tent flap fell closed, Hartmann stepped out into the cold morning and looked at his men. Mechanics, exhausted and hollow-eyed, hunched over wounded fighters trying to patch what was left of their broken planes. Pilots, old friends and new, sat around a smoldering fire sipping weak coffee in silence. Faces streaked with soot and fear stared back at him. Mothers clutched trembling infants, guarding crates of ammunition and their precious blankets. He paused, feeling the eyes of the entire wing upon him, waiting for his next move.
In that moment, Erich Hartmann felt the weight of every day he had spent in combat. He remembered the young squadron mates lost to Soviet guns, the wingmen who had trusted him with their lives. He remembered the oath he had taken long ago, to lead and protect those who flew with him. Never in all his service had he defied an order. But this was not a fight against enemy fighters. It was a reckoning of conscience. The freezing air on the field was as oppressive as the question hanging between them. Standing rigid in the pale morning light, Hartmann wrestled with his duty. The last rays of dawn illuminated the silent faces around him. Behind those faces were the graves of comrades he had watched over for years. Ahead lay an uncertain future under the Soviet yoke. He imagined the terror in the women's eyes if he vanished, the children clutching tattered toys for comfort. The command's instruction echoed, "Fly west to the British." Hartmann's mind raced. Could he really do that? He envisioned the terrified faces of his comrades, not officers, but mechanics, radio men, cooks, who had risked everything alongside him. He thought of his wife, awaiting news at home, the letters he had written and never sent. He recalled whispered rumors of Soviet captivity, tales of brutality, cold starvation, forced betrayal, and secret prisons. Hartmann's lips tightened. If he left, who would stand up for these men? Who would care for the wounded and frightened? To him, the answer was clear. A leader could not abandon his own. Breaking the hush, Hartmann spoke quietly, but with iron resolve. "No," he said firmly. Hermann Graf, listening intently, met his gaze and nodded once. "I stay too," Graf added softly. Their decision hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. In that heartbeat, Hartmann felt fear and resolve warring inside him. This choice would mark him a dissenter, possibly a traitor in the eyes of some, but he saw no other path. Hartmann later explained his stand with clarity born of conviction. He said, "I never disobeyed an order before, but I could not leave my men. That would have been bad leadership." In refusing, he honored the unwritten code of camaraderie that bound these soldiers together, even at the cost of his own safety. Around him, others saw the steely determination in his eyes and whispered to one another, uncertain of what would follow. With dawn breaking fully, Hartmann put his decision into action. There was no arguing further. Orders could be followed or defied, and he had chosen the latter. Now he needed to organize the aftermath. He moved among the stunned men, his voice low but firm, drawing on the instinct that had kept them alive in combat. "Destroy anything you can't take," he instructed the mechanics. Heart pounding, he watched as they obeyed. Mechanic by mechanic, they dismantled the dying machines. Bullet holes were drilled out and widened. Fuel tanks were drained dry onto the earth. Ammunition belts were piled and ignited. One by one, propellers slowed to a standstill. Engines went silent forever. Each explosion cracked like a grim salute to the planes they once flew, machines that had carried them through battle, now reduced to scrap. "This is all we have left," Hartmann told them, voice thick. "They can't have it." He turned away as flames began to consume his beloved Bf-109, the black tulip painted on its nose flickering out of existence. Behind him, his pilots gathered their possessions. Some sat on wingtip crates, coughing as smoke stung their eyes. Mothers held children tightly, trying to shield them from the noise. Uniform jackets were exchanged for civilian coats, Goggles and insignia were tucked away out of sight. In these final moments, even the destruction carried pride. Hartmann, Graf, and a handful of sergeants led the ragged survivors westward. They marched on foot along winding roads cratered by shells, surrounded by limping wounded and patched vehicles. The distant crack of small arms fire and thunder of artillery grew ever closer, but on the horizon the stars and stripes appeared. The 90th American Infantry Division holding back the coming storm. The men quickened their pace as a renewed hope kindled in their chests. Under the wary eyes of tired GIs, Hartmann presented his pilot's sword and worn flight logbooks. The Americans said little. Their faces were etched with exhaustion and quiet relief. A lieutenant flipped through the documents, then motioned for the men to sit by a smoky fire. For a heartbeat, Hartmann dared to hope. He was alive, and so were most of his men. Behind them, the last embers of battle flickered out of existence. On the morning of May 11th, the Americans formed the Germans into lines. An officer spoke quietly. By prior agreement, every soldier who had fought on the Eastern Front was to be turned over to the Soviet Union. Hartmann's heart sank. The sergeant beside him tightened his jaw. Without ceremony, the Western troops marched their former enemies through an open field toward the waiting Red Army. As Hartmann and his comrades were led away, chaos erupted on the airfield. Soviet soldiers herded the remaining German women and children into a dark grove at bayonet point. No cries escaped into the cold morning. The German soldiers stood helplessly, heads bowed. Hartmann's vision blurred. His comrades from that day, pilots, mechanics, cooks, were all going to face the Soviets after all. He had made his choice, and now the cost was clear.
What followed was a descent into cruelty that none of them had expected. Hartmann, the bluest-eyed black devil, was now prisoner number 457 in the Soviet Gulag. The Red Army, hungry for revenge and wary of German aces, treated him like a marked man. He was given rags to wear, a thin soup to eat, and endless questions about Nazi secrets. Guards demanded he betray whatever he knew about the Me-262 jet fighter. When he refused, they brought a thick steel baton. On a freezing morning, an interrogator held up a telegram pretending to be from Hartmann's wife, saying she and their baby son were in danger. Hartmann's stomach lurched, but he said nothing. He refused everything. Even as the guardsman's baton split the skin on his back, or he was crammed into a cell so small he could not lie down, Hartmann would not yield. Interrogators pressed false confessions of war crimes. He spat them out. He demanded a real trial, appealing to honor and treaties, only to be met with sneering contempt. Instead, his captors escalated their tactics. They executed officers he had fought alongside, starved others around him, and locked him alone in darkness. Each time, Hartmann emerged bruised but unbroken. When forced labor came, he refused that too. Each refusal earned him more punishment. 7 months in solitary, a beating for every defiance, and even electric shocks for writing forbidden letters. Once, in quiet protest, Hartmann staged a hunger strike. The Soviets reacted by strapping him to a chair and force-feeding him through a tube. He nearly fainted, but when he awoke, he demanded his rights as a prisoner. There was only laughter in response, and he was dragged back to isolation. Even in those bleak barracks, Hartmann became an unlikely symbol of resistance. Bruised and gaunt, he still walked the prison grounds with his head held high, meeting terrified men with a defiant glare. Fellow prisoners whispered stories. He taught German lullabies to help frightened soldiers sleep, joked grimly about life after the war, and lifted spirits by simply refusing to break. The Black Devil is laughing at them, they said. His legend grew not for victories in the air, but for refusing to give up on the hope of freedom. Years wore on in the Siberian camps. Finally, after Stalin's death, Hartmann's name emerged in diplomatic talks. In 1955, a decade after Germany's surrender, Erich Hartmann, war's deadliest dogfighter, was unexpectedly released and sent home. He returned to a West Germany that was itself rising from ruin. A teary reunion with his wife followed. Their infant son had died during his captivity, a tragedy he could never undo. The horrors of those years would never leave him, but at last he was home. In the new German Air Force, Hartmann was welcomed as a hero and a teacher. He flew jets, trained young pilots, and insisted that every airman be properly protected and trained. He never lost the creed that had driven him in 1945. Loyalty to his men was paramount. He became known for speaking his mind, refusing to fly planes he believed were unsafe, arguing that every pilot's life was precious. He even insisted on keeping his old pistol at ceremonies, a quiet protest against blind orders. Decades later, history fully vindicated the ace's choice. In 1997, long after Hartmann's death, the Russian government formally cleared his name of all the charges that had sent him to the Gulag. The man who had once defied orders was finally recognized. His fateful decision, to stay with his unit rather than chase personal safety, was hailed not as folly, but as the highest example of leadership. Hartmann had shown that some loyalties run deeper than any command, and that honor outlives orders. In the years since, Hartmann's story has served as a lesson to pilots and soldiers. True bravery is not just measured in victories, but in standing up for what is right. He lived to build a new Air Force and train young pilots, but he never flew another combat mission. In interviews later in life, he would simply say, "I did what I believed I had to." To those who knew him, the day he refused to fly was the day his character became legend. For audiences now, it is a timeless reminder that even in war, humanity and loyalty can prevail. In old age, Hartmann would watch modern jets streak across the sky and know he had earned the right to look on in peace. Those who had fought with him never forgot that day. They told its story like a torch passed to future generations, that they might understand its meaning. The story of the man once called the Black Devil is remembered not only for its epic dogfights, but for the single act of defiance that followed. Hartmann stood amid the ashes of war, choosing humanity over convenience. In that quiet refusal lies the answer to why he was right and the enduring lesson of his legacy. In the darkest hour of war, his courage became a beacon of hope for all who would hear his story. For Hartmann, the war's final flight happened on the ground that day. He refused to go higher in command, choosing the horizon of humanity instead. History has proven that he was right. He never wrote a book or sought acclaim. His actions spoke louder than any medal could. Hartmann's stand has become a story told to future leaders as a definition of integrity. Where others sought only to survive, Hartmann sought to do the right thing, and history has agreed that he was. And in that choice, Erich Hartmann's true victory was won.